and welcome to another edition of PopCultX Little Talks, where we dive into conversations with a wide variety of creative minds. Today, we're continuing our discussion on auteurs. Think of this as bonus time or extra innings, if you will. Now, as some might call it fate, others might say it's brilliant planning on my part. But either way, we are joined by a very special guest, the man who literally wrote the book on one of the auteurs we discussed in episode 155. And that is, of course, Professor LatinX himself, Frederick Luis Aldama. Professor, welcome back to the show.
Oh, gosh, it's a big, huge pleasure. And it's just seeing where you've kind of been and how far you've kind of come along, the two of you. I love the organic, smart, free-flowing nature of each of the episodes. Super insightful. This is learning at its best. So thanks for having me back.
Thank you for coming back. I'm glad you call it learning, because it's really, I don't want to say it's learning. Well, I know it's learning for me. I learn a lot just by having conversations here with Gabe and our guest panelists, and it's stuff that opens my mind, and I hope that it does that for others, because maybe it extends their bubble of what they're into, or just, you know, their world around them. And hopefully through our conversations that happens for more people than just me. So let's just jump right into it. You wrote a book called The Cinema of Robert Rodriguez, which was fascinating. I got through the first little bit of it, and right away you spoke of Robert Rodriguez as an auteur, which was really cool, because he was one of the ones I did mention in our previous episode 155, which out there, if you haven't watched it yet, go to our YouTube channel and give it a good watch. It was a great conversation with Jack, Adrian, and Gen X and I about auteurs in both the film and comic book space. So just, can you give us a little bit, Professor, a little bit more in-depth insight into maybe the mind of Robert Rodriguez and how he is really the author of his films?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, first, I loved that PopCultX episode. You all throwing down and talking about some of my favorite directors. It was also mentioned in passing how kind of auteurs, or this idea of an MC, a master of control, master of ceremony type kind of entity, right? That's kind of controlling all of the aspects, is very male dominated, certainly in the conversation. Now, of course, we all know that there are many women of color who are out there making films, but they don't get the same kind of spotlight. So I thought that was interesting, something to bring up. And related to that, I mean, think about like history of the Oscars and, all of the, Oscars so white stuff. That was really important. But really, gosh, only a handful at most women directors, right, being given academies, recognized for their extraordinary work, even though we have a deep, long list of women. And this, of course, relates to sort of the societal frame around someone like Robert Rodriguez coming up in the early 90s. And I mention all of this as background because, people don't put Robert Rodriguez in the same sentence as like David Lynch, an auteur that was brought up, or even less so Truffaut, all those French guys, that were really at the cutting edge of French cinema. All of those guys, right? So we don't put them in the same category, and yet we should. And that's what, as having read my book, I do. And yeah, if we only think about auteurs as this kind of making of precious films that we teach to a very small number of students in our film studies classrooms, then we're not getting it, right? And part of the Robert Rodriguez book is not only that I love his films, and I love them because they entertain, right? In all of the different ways that they do in these crazy ways. But you have this MC who is like, if he didn't know it, he taught himself. And like, how much more auteur can you get with someone who is a creative, like massive energy ball, who then says, guess what? I don't know how to use a steady cam. So for Desperado, I'm, instead of hiring a, steady cam operator, I'm going to teach myself. What about the score for this one? Well, I know how to, make music. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. What kind of, I don't have a dolly. I'm going to use a wheelchair. That is, to me, like the epitome of this kind of director and the director's presence, who is not only technically innovating, but training and retraining and educating themselves to bring what's in their brain out into the world. And for me, that is the epitome of a kind of, auteur director, getting away, pushing away highbrow versus lowbrow, French cinema, David Lynch, whatever, versus like the entertaining stuff. You've got someone out there who's doing the work to exercise and materialize whatever's up here in their imagination out into the world. That for me is an auteur.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you hit it right there with the highbrow versus lowbrow, the entertaining of the masses, if you will. And I think that's why I mentioned Mel Brooks as being my favorite, because he absolutely was there just to entertain people and not be the whole classical definition for the few people who want to know what an auteur really is. But he was there to entertain. And just like Robert Rodriguez does, they both just gave us films that were pure them. And if they took away one part of the piece of film that they created, it wouldn't have the same feel, and it wouldn't be their babies, I guess, if you will. So yeah, definitely.
No, for sure. Like Mel Brooks, those are like, there is a, one of the words that you all used in that podcast was unique, right? And I love that you brought up the Mel Brooks stuff, because comedy, just like women, just like directors of color, typically get a kind of short shrift. They don't get the kind of attention that they deserve. Comedy is a weird like genre, right? Like we can talk about this, like, the mashup of the Road movie with the noir and the Frank Miller and the this, but like comedy, no one talks about directors of comedy as auteurs.
Right. That is true. But we do. We do here at PopCultX. So there you go.
Yes.
You heard it here first, I guess.
Yes, definitely.
Gabe, I'm curious. Did you have a favorite director, a tour that you really resonates with you?
Well, speaking of Robert Rodriguez, yeah, that he definitely resonated with me. One of the things that I love about Robert Rodriguez is his sort of punk rock approach to filmmaking, where, it's kind of do it yourself. I'm definitely of that generation. When El Mariachi came out, he famously made that film then, for almost nothing. And for someone like me, that was really inspiring, because you may not have all the connections in the world. You may not have a big budget, but you still have a dream. You still have a perspective. You can go out there and create something fantastic. So he sticks out for me in that regard. Just an amazing will for him to be able to accomplish such a great film with such limited resources.
Yeah. Inspiring to us as a generation of film goers, filmmakers, right? All of that. You're right. I mean, I don't know, Gabe, if you were, I was in Berkeley when El Mariachi came out, and I was an undergrad, just on my way to finishing up, and it was a watershed. It was a milestone. It was like all those things. Someone just wrote a book about the summer of 1990 as this big moment in cinema, and I'm like, maybe, but actually, I think I would push it to 92. And Rodriguez and Linklater and all the Soderbergh and all these, you know, Allison Anderson, all these amazing people that, like you said, were just showing us you can go out and do this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It is outstanding what can happen when you have your dream and the ambition behind that dream, which I think, I don't want to speak, yeah, for myself. It sometimes lacks the ambition. The dream might be there, but sometimes the ambition isn't. So to have that great combination, it just showcases what you can achieve.
Yeah. One thing I do, if I can jump in and add, there was another concept in the Robert Rodriguez book and something I develop a little bit more in my Latinx superheroes and mainstream comics, but intentionality. There was this weird moment in the academy and in film studies, literary studies in general, blah, 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 when like it was a bad word to talk about intentionality.
Interesting.
And part of it was that the text, say the film, the comic book, the literary artifact, once it's made, it's out in the world and we do whatever we want with it. Yeah, that's true. I mean, to a point, right? But I thought, like, that's just not right, because there are creatives like Rodriguez, like some of the folks that we just talked about, many others, Alex Rivera, right? Richard Kelly, Donnie Darko, speaking of Danny, right? You know, Barry Jenkins, Moonlight, holy criminy, right? What an insanely beautiful movie. But then, right, George Miller's Mad Max Fury Road, holy, like, that is cinematography art at its most epic and gorgeous, right? And you're going to tell me that that's like the same as I don't know, a popcorn film that I go and watch, eat my popcorn, a kind of bubblegum film, and then it entertained me mildly, but like I'll never think about it again, which is like 90% of stuff out there. Heck no. It's because, like you both were saying, it's the will to get it done, and to do it in the most extraordinary and skillful ways, and put something out there that at once does take us on this epic journey, but that does it in the most willful, intentionally gorgeous ways, that stand the test of time. And I when people were like intentionality out the window, I'm like, that's messed up. Because you and all of us in this space right now know that there is a big difference between someone who's just pushing it out there to hopefully get some butts in the seat and make some profit, and those who are, yes, doing that and kind of mindful, but first and foremost putting out in the world something that is very intentionally, beautifully crafted and sculpted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But to piggyback on that, how do you think those filmmakers, those auteurs, how do you think they influence more representation and diversity in the stories they tell?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as you both know, only about, gosh, of all the scripts, of all of the extraordinary distillations and reconstructions, if you will, of the world that we live in, that are presented in script form and pitch form and so on, only about, I don't know, less than 1% of those make it to a screen. So there's this gatekeeping, money, production, all that stuff that's makes it, and even today with the internet and with film technology, it's still an obstacle.
Yeah.
That said, we all know platform, digital, cameras now. I mean, Soderbergh, what he did that whole film Unsane with smartphones. And there are a number of, gorgeous films that have been shot with smartphones and,
Yeah.
put together through post-production in ways that are really exciting. I think that technology reaching more hands is a significant shift, and those more hands are hands of directors that have typically been kept out. So directors of color, women, young women. I have a lot of young women and kids of color in my classes that are moving in the direction of making comics and films, but especially films where money has been, in the historical sense, like prohibitive, like a gatekeeper. So I think that, like, and then of course, the two of and you just mentioned, we have our role models, we have our inspirations, we have, Catherine Bigelow, I think, was one of the first women directors to have walked off the Academy Award stage with an Oscar for Best Director, right?
Yeah.
For, I think it was Hurt Locker. Yeah. And so we see them, you see it and you can be it. And then the technologies is much more within our reach, training in and through the technologies. But there's still obstacles. It's like the Mel Brooks obstacle, but, in terms of folks of color making story and film, somehow we are not seen as good enough.
Yeah. That is sadly the case. Although hopefully with the, like you said, the technology into more hands, that shift can begin, and we can see a greater diverse lineup at the Academy Awards and also at the box offices as well. Another place that we spoke about, and this is just kind of like jumping to the other topic with no segue in between. We talked about comic books and how different writers, illustrators were the auteurs of like the graphic novels. Think Frank Miller, and of course, I want to ask you about that because you are one of the great minds in that space of comic books who are really. I don't want to just say you know a lot, but you do know a lot. So, who would be like some of your, I guess, people, art writer, illustrators that you would point out as those that are like the auteurs of the comic book world?
Yeah. Well, actually, there is a nice segue from Robert Rodriguez into this space because actually, as you both know, Robert Rodriguez wrote the strips, the cartoons for the Daily Texan when he was an undergraduate at UT Austin. And yeah, and his thumbnails for his first film that he traveled on the film fest circuit, Bedhead, a short film, which by the way is like mind-blowingly good, and it's included on the DVD version of El Mariachi. I'm sure there are many other places you can download it, but it is definitely worth not only watching but kind of studying. Made on a VCR deck, right? I mean, with a camcorder and then cut on a VCR deck. But yeah, he incorporates cartoons into that, and there is, and as you mentioned in the PopCultX episode, Frank Miller and Rodriguez kind of, in the Sin City recreation is a significant intersection, right? Interface between, and nice segue. In many ways, they are very close cousins, maybe even siblings, right? Comics and film, visual storytelling as a dominant, and stitching, inviting us as audiences to co-create with the the visual stories that are being shown, either panel by panel or frame by frame. So yeah, beautiful way that these two things engage one another. And there are many comic book creators, writers who have not only had their works adopted into film, but have made the leap, writing screenplays or, even consulting. Anyway, something came up in your PopCultX discussion, which is that this distinction between the writer artist as one entity and writer, artist, letterer, colorist, inker, etc., as multiple entities.
Right.
And I think that's worth pushing a little bit on, and then we can get into some specific comics. But, it goes back to the Robert Rodriguez example, where you have Robert Rodriguez. Yeah, in his first couple of films, he was, or certainly in El Mariachi, he was working on a shoestring. So it was really him and, his best friend, and then, actors, non-professional actors, and,
right.
The whole thing kind of being made by Robert. But then as his budget and his films became more, the story worlds became much more complicated. Many more people are involved, costuming, all that stuff, casting, etc. And then when you get to something like Alita, which is a very big budget film that he was given to make, then you have you've got gazillions of people, right? Including all these CGI studios that are being brought in to kind of, make the story world happen beyond the stage. Anyway, I mentioned that because I think that might be there's a false dichotomy between if you are an artist and a writer entity, like, let's say, because I'm not, like, I can thumbnail, but I'm not both a writer and an artist when it comes to making my comics. I work with an artist.
Right.
And in some cases, I've worked, after I script, I work with an artist illustrator, someone who does the penciling, someone who does the inking, someone who does the coloring, and someone who does the lettering. So, like, it's a whole army of people. But I think it goes back to the same Robert Rodriguez model. Like, it depends. It's like in that kind of situation, the best comics that I can think of, and hopefully mine, you might hopefully include those, like Labyrinth's Born in that, are the ones where you do have a sense of how the parts cohere into a whole.
Yeah.
They make it, and it feels organic, but that requires an MC who is gently yet rigorously kind of pushing the project forward, making sure, like, the people that are chosen, the letterers, the colorists, etc., are going to realize the vision, right? So I think that just as much as we could have control with the author, the writer and the artist as one entity, we can also have that same kind of result with a multiple number of creatives. I know I'm talking a lot here, but I'm trying to push through a lot of information. But
I see what you mean, though, about I think the MC is a great word for that, because it is really the person who is maybe even like the ringleader of a circus, right? You're guiding everyone towards telling the story as a whole, but you're the one at the central figure point who's bringing it all together. And it's all going to be your vision, even though you might not physically be doing the lettering, the inking, the penciling. It's still your vision, and you're tying it all together. It would be completely different if it was a different visionary person leading it. So yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. I don't know, Gabe, if you if you wanted to add anything, I feel like I've been talking a lot.
I'm really curious, and how do you develop that relationship between all the collaborators that you have, that you are able to successfully come together and create a world that, you know, is in your mind at first and put down on paper, and then, you know, here it is, it comes to life in a comic book or graphic novel. How do you develop that relationship so that it's so successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, let me just say that it can be a huge challenge, and even there can be, even in the best of scenarios, moments of like breaking points, where either it's a scheduling kind of misalignment, or it's a creative misalignment that you didn't expect. And sometimes, and I'm going to give you some specific examples in a second, sometimes you actually have to break with someone, which is the hardest thing to do. But other times you can let time do the work of helping bring the project back on point. And let me give you a couple of examples. So Through Fences, which is YA set series of braided, sort of integrated stories by youth living on the US-Mexico border today, and the different psychological, physical kind of experiences and journeys that they each go through. There was a moment when working with with the illustrator Oscar Garza, when he texted me and he said, I just can't do it. I can't do this right now. There's so much going on in my personal life. There's so much happening with the separation of families that have crossed the border, where children are being isolated from their siblings and from parents, and the trauma of that. And he said, I tried and I tried and I tried again, and I just can't do it. I cannot do it right now. And I said, Oscar, look, let's put it on the shelf. It's the pandemic. There's a lot of stuff that we're all going through right now. Let's put it on hold. And it took him a couple of months to get back to it, or actually like half a year. And it was awesome, because when he did, he helped bring to life this extraordinary series of stories from the perspective of little ones all the way up through teens, that we just don't hear about, that humanizes the experiences of children and teenagers living, along the US-Mexico border. And yeah, so time was the great healer there. And I should say this too. I picked Oscar very specifically because I knew that his style and his way of abstracting from the realism, the gritty realism, of the traumas of living in the borderlands, his more abstract style would be more palatable and welcoming for a greater number of readers to step into these individuals in their psychologies and experiences. If I had chosen an artist who was much more realistic, say photographic realistic in their rendering, it would have been way too much for you all. You would have pushed it away. It would have been too much. On the other side, with something like Labyrinth's Born, where it is really a collective, there were moments when I wasn't sure it was going to kind of finally work. And it was definitely some struggle there between some, personalities and so on. But again, a gentle but yet rigorous kind of guiding and at the same time reshuffling of the deck, but at the same time still allowing those to feel included that might not have been included on certain aspects of the project, finally did result in, the birthing, to use Danny's, terms from earlier, of something new in the world. But it is tough. Now imagine on the level of a film. Holy moly.
What I like about what you just mentioned is, for those that listen to our podcast that are creators or are creatives, it shows the example of, the hard work that has to be put in to create something. And sometimes you have to have some grace when you're working with people and not be so demanding that you have to build that relationship and say, if you need some time, I'm going to allot some time for you to be able to deal with whatever you're dealing with, but we'll still get back on track, because we need to be on the same page when it comes to creating this particular piece of work. So I think that's really, I'm thankful that you shared that, because a lot of people, I think, are trying to navigate that currently within their own work. Is how do I communicate with my artist? How do I communicate with my editor? Am I going to be a demanding type person that demands that it be done now? Am I going to be more gracious? Am I going to be a more patient person? And so it helps illustrate, how someone goes through that process.
I think that gets back to Gabe, to our episode of with auteurs, that we spoke about. A lot of these auteurs are really demanding, are really people that you might not want to work with again after being with them. So yeah, I agree with you there that the grace is needed at times just to keep everyone on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's harder. The more, as we know, the more big entities, big publishers, producers, film, houses, etc., studios, the more they're involved, the more pressure, and so someone like, I was thinking about how Robert Rodriguez and others like David Lynch, you all mentioned, but and many other directors like Chris Nolan and so on have like their usual pool of actors that they work with, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised, because those directors clearly, and I'm, this is implied, this isn't something that I necessarily know directly through biographical fact, but I imagine those actors want to work with those directors because they get the projects done. And at the same time, like Gabe, you were saying, they, I imagine, allow for a certain grace of presence and kind of allow the actors to breathe, at the same time that there's a guidance, a kind of gentle, rigorous guidance. Of course, those actors are going to be coming back to work with those directors, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. The first example that I kind of think of is Salma Hayek with Robert Rodriguez, and how she came back for multiple projects. And I don't know, as you mentioned, but I could speculate that he must have treated her with a vast amount of respect, because the role that she had in Desperado, in From Dusk Till Dawn, could really be just a simple like bombshell sex exploitive type role, but he really allowed her to have to bring some diversity to that, and to show her as a strong person who obviously is still a sexy person, but did have some strength and become even an anti-hero in From Dusk Till Dawn. I mean, you have people that are fans of her vampire character still today, and that would not be the case if he did not allow her to approach that character in such a strong way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, Danny Trejo, right? He's the phenomenon that he is, because Robert Rodriguez was like, "You're amazing. Let's get you into this like universe that I'm creating this trilogy of like, the Desperado stuff plus the mariachi, the machete. But then, yeah, like I can only, Chris Nolan must be the same way, right? You have Chris Nolan, who's hands down for me, as well as, people like the Wachowski sisters and, the early Ridley Scott stuff and, Bigelow and Rodriguez and, all of these, Alex Rivera, these pioneers. Chris Nolan, I mean, jaw dropping, right?
Talk about intentionality. Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know. I don't think I could write a book on Chris Nolan because there's constant challenging of what he's done before, technically, formally, and then in terms of content. But also, he must be amazing to work for, and that's, I think, we see that in a very material way with the actors going back again and again to work with someone like Chris Nolan.
There has been, to a certain degree, those critics out there who always lambast those directors who cast repeatedly the same actors. But I think, on the other hand, it's what you said. Those actors want to work with that director, so it's that needs to be taken into account for, I think.
Mm-hmm. By the way, speaking of Salma Hayek and Robert Rodriguez, say opening that crossover bridge or possibility for Salma into now. I mean, Salma is mainstream, say Hollywood. George Clooney, we can't forget that From Dusk Till Dawn, that was George Clooney's crossover.
Yeah, it's true.
And you can tell too, like what I love that film for, and for many things, but I also love teaching it because it so beautifully articulates what we've just been talking about in terms of intentionality, where you have Tarantino's stamp very firmly on that first half. The road, the fugitive, the road warrior, the road narrative. And then you have that shift when they are at the Titty Twister bar, where it becomes Rodriguez's film. And it is, just like I love Wes Anderson. You mentioned Wes Anderson in that PopCultX to teach like Budapest Hotel, the Grand Budapest Hotel. I love, for similar and different reasons, teaching From Dusk Till Dawn, because it really allows us to see clearly how the intention, the willfulness, the agency of a story is shaped very much by two different auteurs or directors or MCs, whatever we're going to call them.
Absolutely. I've seen From Dusk Till Dawn several times. I remember the first time watching it, and even till recently. And that shift, like you just mentioned, I never really thought about it, but it is so true. It is so true. You got the Tarantino-esque feel of the of the thieves as they're on the run from the law and they're trying to escape to Mexico, and then it turns into this vampire-esque film. And absolutely, that is so cool. See, I learned something to bring it back.
And Wes Anderson he does make precious movies, but his films are mesmerizing, aren't they? Like,
Yeah, absolutely. And talk about a reoccurring cast of actors. Wes Anderson probably does it, I would say, more so than anyone else. You can always tell a film just by seeing his films. At least you see the actors. You see Bill Murray. You see, Bruce Willis is in for a lot of them. You see those actors. You're like, oh, maybe that's a Wes Anderson film. And sure enough. And although his later work, like The French Connection, was it French Connection? I think is he started to expand his roster of actors, which I thought was fascinating, and that movie was very, very good.
Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about some of the Mexican auteurs like Guillermo del Toro or
Oh my
Alfonso
goodness,
Cuarón,
that is so true.
right, Iñárritu. But I think it's worth, just reflecting, on that a cinema that has come up from the south of the border, and the sensibility not only of the kind of stories and the content, but also the ways that they also give extraordinary shape in their unique ways to their different stories. And Del Toro with his Devil's Backbone, which was like really extraordinary, but then of course Pan's Labyrinth, and then I don't know if you caught the was it The Shape of Water? Was that the one?
Yeah.
Yeah. But oh my God, like they're all like deeply good stories. They pull us in, and at the same time, they're also pushing the envelope on cinematic storytelling.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, you mentioned Alfonso Cuarón and his films. I mean, I think to like even his one of his most recent ones, Roma, it was just so beautifully shot and told, and it was just mind blowing his use of like, of course, of black and white, and just in the time frame that Hollywood doesn't even really know about or talk about, and it really opened my eyes to that. I mean, the uprising of the workers there in the what am I trying to say? Where it was shot at, and it was just
in
it was
Mexico
just so
City, and
wonderful
the
to see.
yeah, no, it was beautiful. Um, it was, one of the say trademarks, or one of the techniques that we think of when we think of Mexican cinema is the long take. And, without typical Hollywood, you've got like 1, 2, 3 seconds, boom, cut, 1, 2, cut, 1, 2, 3, cut. And with Cuarón and Iñárritu and Del Toro, in their different ways, they invite us back into story where we can actually have the time to feel, to think, to engage without this constant stuff happening. Now look, I love the constant like stuff, but there is something to be said about a cinema that invites us to also reflect and to take pause.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of storytelling and creation, I'd love to hear about your latest piece of work, and if you could share with our audience what it's about and what the process was of creating it.
Yeah, so thanks, Gabe. So I had this crazy, speaking of like the MC and all that stuff, one thing that's difficult to control is when our stories, when these cultural objects that we create are put into the world. And I mention this because I had the absolutely almost true adventures of Max Rodriguez. In my YA novel that's has spot illustrations, Through Fences, which is the graphic novel, focused on different vignettes, chapters of youth growing up in the borderlands, and my sci-fi climate fiction graphic novel called Labyrinth Born. They were all released within 3 weeks of one another.
Wow.
Well,
And that happened January, February of this year. So the upside was that, kind of publicity machine around them could basically, triple dip.
Yeah.
But the bad thing was I was literally like chasing trains, especially when it came to invited, readings or book signings. And, one was over here for Through Fences, and this one was over here for the YA novel. And so I'm not complaining, but yeah. Now, so I'm going to mention just really quickly the absolutely almost true adventures of Max Rodriguez, which is the YA novel, Gabe. So that was me going back to this idea of gatekeeping. Also, by the way, in the literary space, I have been on so many committees for awards for YA fiction, Latino YA fiction in general. I read a lot of YA fiction because out of self-interest and because, I like it. But I've also been noticing, with Latino YA fiction coming out of the big houses, the publishing houses, I started noticing another formula. Like, okay, the big houses are clearly interested in, and they're buying from writers via agents certain kinds of stories. Because we're starting to see the same stories again and again. No shade thrown, because like you both said, like this, no matter if it's the kind of formulaic or not, writing, creating takes a lot of work. So no shade thrown on any of our fellow creatives. But when it starts to feel the same again and again, almost like a factory conveyor belt, it gets a little bit monotonous. So I'm like, there's a YA story that I want to tell that's completely, off that conveyor belt. And it's the story of Max, who, after they were born, the dad and the mama, and they have a very interesting, cool relationship. They're not a typical parenting couple. The dad's a total Marxist, and wanted to name Maxine, by a much more familiar Marxist, name, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, the point is that Maxine, the second that they can, basically says, I want to be known as Max. Now, Maxine is born with this condition where the flap under the tongue is much too tight. It's very tight, and they can't actually speak. They can't speak, articulate until they're much older. By the time the doctors figure it out, Maxine has already read all sorts of stuff, comic books and philosophy, and so into it that they decide that they'd rather not talk for a while. And anyway, this arms them with the kind of knowledge and literary and philosophical and comic book stuff to allow them to navigate this topsy-turvy world of the mid-1980s. And it's a really incredible journey. When I was approached by agents, they told me, well, you need to make sure to clean up the mama. You can't have that character talking about how she reads porn magazines, because she does. She's like, when Max and Max's older brother Che are, the kind of the birds and the bees talk, the mom naturalizes their desires and sexualities by telling them, hey, I'm a woman and I also have this stuff. And this is like, here's my box of porno that I like to read. Right. So there were things that the agent said you need to take out, including, by the way, Max's identity, coming into an identity as a two-spirit. That by the end, I'm like, you want me to write a whole other book, and that's not what Max Rodriguez is. Yeah. So they told me, I can't sell your book the way it is. And I, Danny's read it. The many that have read it are like, what? This is insanely like,
Yeah, that's insane to hear that.
yeah.
It
And so
really
that
is.
book, yeah. So like those are, now imagine how many of the Max Rodriguez stories are out there that are not getting, told because agents are basically already,
That's
before you
true.
even get through the doors, told, no, 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 you have to vanillaize, you have to erase any of the complexities and textures, because the publishing houses where I will make my commission as an agent will only buy this kind of a story.
Mm, wow. Yeah, that's mind-boggling just to think that. I mean, first off, the book was fantastic. It was a, I don't want to call it a fast read in that it was, quick or whatever, but I just couldn't put it down. So it was a fast read in that I wanted to get through it. I want to hear more about her adventures. Hopefully, sequel coming
Yeah,
up.
there
I
will
don't
be.
know, or their
Technically.
adventures, I guess. Sorry,
Yep.
and the dual spiritedness of Max was fantastic to read. I mean, I've heard about that through other stories and whatnot, but it's just the way you encapsulated it with her or their, sorry, I keep saying that, with their adventures. It was just very wonderful. And even though I might not be even the target audience for that book, it really resonated with me right from the get-go of the dedication that you put on there for the misfits, for the stories and dreams of all misfits, botch jobbers, and unapologetic originals. I was hooked. I really was. Read that and I was like, wow, this book is for me. Even though I'm not target audience, this book I will dive into.
Well, I think sometimes when people think that they aren't the target audience, they're especially the target audience because they're the ones that are needing to read those types of stories,
Yeah,
become familiar with the otherness of humanity. We sometimes we trap ourselves in a bubble and we want to see the same things over and over again. I think that's a problem when you see a lot of like the issues with like Marvel Studios where fanboys don't want to see stories about
that's
women of
true.
color. They don't
Mm,
want to see heroes that are different from themselves. So those movies, even though we make films, women make films for women audiences, but especially men need to go see those films because they do need to see those characters. And that's so great that you're able to bring the tale of a two-spirited person to the masses. And I am definitely going to go check it out. I definitely encourage all of our readers to go check it out because it's a story that I don't think is often put into the pop culture universe,
yeah.
and so we definitely need to check it out.
I did have some questions
Where?
though.
Oh, go ahead, Danny.
Oh, about the book, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I know you being of Guatemalan and Irish American descent, how much of it of your own growing up did you put into the book of some of the stories
Mm.
there?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and the question that many of us creatives get when, especially when we're in public venues and so on. This curiosity about the biographical
Yeah.
and where the biographical meets the fictional, and what kind of blends happen. For me, in all of my creative work, there's always biographical. It springs very deeply from biographical, whether it's an actual like physical experience or a psychological conundrum, some kind of trauma, etc. But at a certain moment, when we strip that down and we reconstruct it, we are thinking about those like you, Danny. So I don't want my fictions to just speak to me. I want them to speak to you and to Gabe and to everyone else. And so there's a moment when this stuff grows beyond. So to give you some examples, the the grandmother, very spirited, really cool character who grows pot in her attic, the abuelita, to pay her bills. And she's like in with this sort of scene of this town where, this drug peddler is, generations of, Italian American, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, weighing up her buds and like, figuring stuff out. She's this rock star, man. She's like drives this, whole green Chevy Nova that's like beefed up.
Dumpster diver too.
Yeah. And well, that's my grandma. I mean, that's what she did.
Oh, wow.
And I remember the first time I saw her like weed plantation in her like attic and her grow lights and everything. And I was like, abuelita, like you can get busted and go to jail. She's like, what are they going to do with an old lady like me? And I'm like, take you to jail.
That is so cool.
That's awesome.
But yeah, there's a lot of me in all of my fiction, and then there's a lot that's there's a lot of me too that wished that fiction was there for me when I was 14, 15. And it wasn't. There's a lot of kind of the younger me in my fiction, especially the YA stuff. There's like that moment in San Jose, like when Max goes to state and has this like mind-blowing experience in a lecture on like this like third world women's conference. I remember that a moment like that only a college campus, at least in my experience, could so radically open me to, after being kind of in a much smaller, small town environment. You know what I mean? So yeah, lots of that. And then bringing it into the world, bringing it alive, creating the story worlds. I also very deliberately wanted it to be serialized like a comic. So each chapter, almost like reading one comic after another. And anyway, I'm so glad you guys brought it up. Max Rodriguez, I love Max, and I hope and it sounds like that Max has already touched, you, Danny. I hope that they continue to touch other readers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and when I was reading it, I could totally see even like an animated film out of it in the style of like the Mitchell versus the Machines type of animation style. I was picturing that in my head as Max and their friends go through their adventures and, try and go find the bicycle parts and stuff like that. And I could totally see that playing out on a film screen somewhere. So fingers crossed, maybe we'll get that one day.
Yeah. Well, so the next iteration of Max will be, it'll be Max in 10th grade. And also I'm going back to the Max 9th grade kind of coming of age that you read. And it'll be my next graphic novel. So,
nice. Okay.
Yeah. So, and that is only, as you both know, even animation film is so expensive. Oh my gosh. So I would love to do it as animated film, like you were saying. I think it really lends itself to it, but it's prohibitively expensive, especially if, you're trying to produce it yourself.
Yeah. Understood. Understandable. But I'm looking forward to the 10th grade. That should be fun. Well, Professor.
No, I can't wait to see where the abuelita goes in 10th grade. Like,
Yes, She was a rock star, absolutely. And Gabe, once you get a hold of the book and give it a read, you'll see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I just ordered it on Amazon, so it's on its way to me now. Once again, I do recommend that all of our listeners and watchers of our podcast go out and purchase it as well to support Professor X and his endeavors. Always good to support creators that are making good work.
Absolutely. And with that, Professor, thank you so much for spending some time with us on this bonus edition of episode 155, our little talk. We really appreciate your time, your insight, and your storytelling, most of all. It is so great to hear, to read, and thank you again.
Thank you both. Wouldn't be here without you, and can't wait till the next time.